People just call me Scotty, so that's who I am. My name is Scotty. Steve Scott is what my mother calls me. Well, she doesn't use the last bit, she just calls me Steve. Stephen if I'm in trouble. And that's it. That's my Twitter handle. I'm currently, I do have lots of different roles in life. I'm an independent developer. I run a conference myself. I'm also the developer evangelist for a company called RemObjects, who you may or may not have heard of, and I'll mention them a little bit later on. I have never been to a conference in Austria before. This is my first one, so I have no idea what you guys are like. I've no idea. You could be the nicest people in the world, or you could be a complete nightmare. I really don't know. And when I normally do conference talks, I normally sit at the back and I take note of what's going on, and I see if the crowd are a bit serious, or whether they're lighthearted, whether they prefer an overview, or whether they prefer the technical stuff, and I try and then adapt to what's going on. But then suddenly, it was almost with horror last night, I'm first. I've got no idea. So, if you don't like what I've got to say this morning, blame the person who put me first, okay? Not me, that's all I'm going to say. From the airport yesterday, got picked up with a bunch of other speakers. You're in that situation with a whole group of people you don't know, but you know that you're all techies of some form and you're all geeks. So you start talking about technology because it's the only thing you know you've got in common right now. It doesn't take long, and then you just start saying about, I remember when I was doing this, I remember doing that, and the longer the journey gets, the younger you get in what the technology you were talking about. And I suddenly realized that I could go a lot further than most people in the bus. When people started saying things like, I used to go into the library and they'd only let me use the internet for 30 minutes, and I used to get really frustrated when I was a kid. And I used to think, libraries didn't even know what computers were when I was a kid. They'd only just discovered books, let alone anything else. And so I just wanted to, it just made me realize how old I am, which was really sad. But never mind that. But I just wanted to put some of what I'm saying today in context of where I've come from, because my opinions will be based on where I've come from. This was my first computer. Anybody remember one of these? No, I'm looking around the room. You're all so... there's a few people who are trying to say, I'm not the oldest in the room either. No. There we are. The ZX81. Yes, it was. It was very British, but I can't help it. I lived in Britain. I could only. There was no internet. I couldn't order from Austria, so I had to just go down the local store. The specs on this thing were quite impressive. It had a 3.25 megahertz, not gigahertz, megahertz CPU. Of course, but the effective speed of the CPU in slow mode. Now, note slow mode is whenever you have the display turned on. Okay, the effective CPU speed in slow mode was 0.804 megahertz if you had a 50 megahertz display, or 0.53 if you had a 60 hertz display, which is understandable that you've lost 80% of your CPU power to drive that really impressive 32 by 24 character display, which was a whole 256 by 192 pixels, or if you wanted to be in the mode, it worked at 64 times 48 dots. This thing was a beast, okay? It had 1K of memory. 1K of memory. Does anybody even recognize what a K is these days? It's so small we don't even work in it anymore. It cost £49.95, which is about 60 euros. In today's money, that's about 196 euros, which was amazing. Remember that the cheapest computer you could probably buy was probably thousands of euros. Well, the euro didn't even exist at the time, but thousands of whatever currency you were using at the time. But of course, it was £49.95 if you bought it in kit form, and you had to pay £69.95 if you wanted someone to put it together for you. So that's where I started, and I've always been a power user, so it was no good to me just having this 1K memory. So I bought the 16K RAM expansion pack for £60, more than the computer cost. Yeah, to get an extra 16K of memory into this beast to make things work for me. And the trouble is with this thing, it plugged into a port on the back of the computer. And if once it was plugged in, if you even move the computer just a little bit, it would fall out. Now, of course, there's no disk drive in this thing. There's no floppies in this thing. If you wanted to save anything, it was about 3 days saving it to cassette. Some of you are probably too young to even remember cassettes. I mean, that's the type of audience we're speaking to here. But isn't there? So actually, my really high-end desk in my bedroom office, remember I was still a kid, I had to tape the computer to the desk to make sure the RAM pack didn't fall out. So this is where I began. And my programming career began, like so many programming careers of people my age, with this program. Oh, it's not even all on the screen. 10, print Scotty is amazing. 20, go to 10. Come on, who started there? Anybody? Yes, there's a few people who started. And I remember that complete joy as I saw, oh, that was it. It was amazing. And so the only reason I'm doing this is firstly to start establishing that when I talk about some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today, I've been through quite a lot of generations of people talking about this. And opinions change, if you're lucky. Some people's don't. And a lot of us out there. And equally, I just wanted to honour the ZX81. So from now on, this is a genuine ZX81 font for which the rest of the presentation will be done in. Just to honour the ZX81. Okay, so these are the other platforms that I have worked on, and we can't see some of them because they've all gone off the screen. Yes, ZX81, the ZX Spectrum which followed. There's an Auric, a Commodore 64. I was speaking to Vigor yesterday and said I'd not done any programming for it, but I realized I then had. There's an Amiga. There's these beasts of mainframes called Primos machines which don't exist anymore. CPM, Convergent Unix, VME, which was ICL's based, VMS, which was VAX based, VM370 and MVS, which is IBM mainframe based. I've developed for Windows 3, 3.1, 95, NT, 2000, XP, Vista and 8. I realized I never did anything for Windows 7, ever. The list isn't. I'm going to have to go develop something just for Windows 7 so I can complete the list. This says OS2. Anybody remember OS2? Yes, I loved OS2. It was amazing. And some Linux stuff, OS 10, which is now just X on there, iOS and Android. So those are platforms that I've done software for. Probably from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After 5 down, I've delivered commercial software for. The rest were hobbies before that. Okay. And these, again, are the languages in which I've delivered software, of which we cannot see most of them. Basic, Pascal, Fortran, Pace. Pace was this 1980s fourth-generation language, which I am so glad died. COBOL, DBase. I think the one that's totally missing must be C, because it's a single letter, so it's gone off there. Another 4GL, which still exists, but I think it's got 3 users, called Mantis. PL1, Programming Language 1. That was an IBM programming language. They were that inventive in those days. It was the first one they'd done, so it was Programming Language 1. It was like a Pascal variant. It was an amazing language. Assembly language. I had to learn assembly language when I was working at a project in the nuclear industry. We were moving software from one machine to another machine, and we came across all this assembly code that no one knew what it did, and we thought before we build it and compile it and deploy it in a nuclear power station, we should probably work out what it does. So that's where I first learned assembly language. Object Pal from Paradox for Windows. Anybody remember Paradox for Windows? Object Pascal. Perl. I'm trying to work out what the RL was there. Perl, C++, Java, Visual Basic, both standard and .NET. Objective-C, I have no idea what the one off there was. I need to look at my own screen, don't I? C#, yes. PHP, Ruby, JavaScript. And I put CoffeeScript in there as well, because I know that's a variant, but there we are. So I've worked in quite a lot of languages. And so over the years, I've been through most of the arguments about what's good, what's not good, what works, what doesn't work, why things are better, why things aren't better. All I'm trying to do is demonstrate to you here that I'm not a fanboy. I'm not this is my one idea and this is all it's way. I've lived through this stuff. Okay, so some of the things I say come from hard experience, and some of it because I have an opinion despite what I've learned. But there we are. We're always going to have that. Okay, so what am I actually supposed to be talking about? Platform native applications, or latform native applications, as we're now on to. Note number 2 for future conferences, do not put slides to edge of screen. Okay, platform native applications. So I guess the question is to start with, what is native? What is native? And one of the things as I was beginning to think about this is, in fact, let's just do a quick survey of the room. Who here would primarily consider themselves web developers, front or back end? Okay. Desktop and mobile sort of developers? Designers? At the wrong conference? Okay. Right. We're okay. So I'm roughly talking to the right set of people, and it seems like there's a few web people in here, which I will talk about a little bit as well, but they've all gone downstairs to learn about colour. There we are. Which is very important, unless you've got a ZX81, which was black and white. So there we are. Okay, so what is native? Well, in the days when I started, this was native. This is what we were talking about. But this is totally irrelevant these days. I mean, no, it's not irrelevant. If your code doesn't end up like that somewhere, it doesn't run. Okay? But it's not relevant to us. The last time anybody thought about what was actually being written at this level was a long, long time ago, for most of us as developers. So I guess more important is the question, not what is native, but what is platform? Because we're talking about platform native. I've realized none of my presenter notes are displaying, but we'll work it out. So I'll probably be going back in a minute to the stuff that I didn't tell you, that I should have told you. Okay, but it's okay, it's morning, you're still awake-ish, so it's there. So what is platform? Well, again, this is a changing dynamic over time. And one of the problems of the internet, and one of the great things about the internet, is information tends to not go away. So when you begin to do searches on things, you get stuff, and it may now be up to an amazing sort of 15 years old and totally irrelevant, but it's still there, and it still forms the argument today, and it's in there, and it's quite interesting watching some of these things come through. But I guess traditionally, if we're talking about platform, we're talking about the operating system. So what is a platform native when we're beginning to talk about the operating system? Well, I guess traditionally we're talking about, is it using something like the Win32 API if you're on Windows? Is it using the core fundamental C libraries of a Linux machine? Is it using Core Foundation on a Mac OS X machine? This is what will be seen as native. And there was a lot of arguments, especially in the mid-90s and the early 90s, about you doing anything that moved away from just writing against the raw APIs for an operating system was non-native. You have to put that into context that machines were really, really slow in those days. And any abstraction from the raw layer was seen as a problem. Any abstraction that came from, that didn't put you right in touch with the rawness of the machine was seen as an issue that you had to work around. And so this issue of native, back in the days when this argument first began, was more to do with performance and speed than it was to do with really convenience or the final solution that you're going to deliver. Because the reality was, for some of the non-native platforms, APIs that began to arise at the time, they were great as a developer, apart from no machine could run them that any average human being had, unless you happen to be deploying to Cray users or something. That's are Cray even around anymore? They were the supercomputers of the day. I don't know if they even small. So the OS was the thing that everybody argued about. But then towards the end of the second half of the 90s, we began to see platform frameworks arising. And this was where maybe even the vendors themselves were beginning to put abstraction layers on top of their OS stuff. So with Windows, we're talking probably 98, 99, when the .NET frameworks were beginning to appear. Now, I was working in the Windows world at this time. I was a Delphi developer or a Delphi developer, depending on which part of the world you come from. And the whole argument that was going on ranging at the time is this whole .NET stuff is completely useless because it's just not native. Okay? Because the Delphi stuff, the Borland guys at the time, they'd written this control library called the VCL, the Visual Control Library. It had turned Windows development into something that you could actually manage. I was speaking with someone in the bar last night, and I remember the first time I ever wrote a Windows program in C, and admittedly I was learning it at the same time. It was for Windows 3.0, and it took me about 10 days to get the first window on the screen. Because when you started a program back then, the first thing you had to do is work out how you're going to handle a message loop, and then how you were going to begin to put those messages out to Windows, and then how the Windows and so what you get when you do file new program was 2 weeks work back in those days when you were trying to learn this stuff. And so this is the environment it's coming up from. So this thing called the Visual Control Library had come along, but this was, the big thing about it was it compiled straight down to the Win32 APIs. Then this .NET stuff comes along, and it's got an abstraction from that. And the big argument was, well, it's not native, and native is just not. If it's not native, it's just not fast enough. The argument was still about speed. They lost the argument. Platform frameworks are probably the way that most people see native development today. So when I say platform frameworks, I think you're not going to get many arguments today that .NET is not writing natively for the platform, for Windows. Any .NET developers in here? You don't have to be embarrassed, sir. Be proud. Yeah? There is a behavior policy in here. Nobody can pick on you for it. Honestly. The code of conduct protects you. And you've got some friends over there if you want to go see them later on. Form the little clique here. Okay, so .NET is probably seen as native. Cocoa on Mac OS X. Any Mac developers here? Oh, see, they're all in a huddle at the back. They found each other before the show. Yeah, see, prepared and advanced. Cocoa Touch. iOS developers? No, about the same people. Cocoa Touch, seen on there. Delvic on the Android platform. Android developers? Oh, yeah, but we're fairly evenly spread. We are a very quite representative group, unless it's the same people putting their hands up for all of these. These are now considered the platform frameworks, and these are probably these days considered native, whereas back 10, 15 years ago, the argument would have been they're not native, whereas now the argument is totally changed. Something that is probably the modern argument that is going on, and is this whole thing about HTML5 versus native, web versus native. But I think just looking back at how history goes, to me, it's the wrong argument that's going on, and eventually we'll get mature enough when we work that out. The fact is, it's not a matter of whether HTML is native or not, it's a matter of how we view the browser. What is the browser? And as long as we continue to live in the era that the browser was something we used to look at websites and brochures and information, this argument will keep on raging. As soon as we come to accept that the browser itself is a platform, then immediately HTML5 and JavaScript become native to the platform. Does that make sense? You see, the browser is far more. Have to view the browser. When I fire up Safari or I fire up Chrome these days, I view it exactly the same way as if I use a Mac mainly. If I'm firing up a virtual machine running Windows on my Mac, I see it exactly the same way. I am firing up an alternative environment. And so what we now have is the tools that are native to the environment you're working on. And part of it is beginning to understand our environment. Okay, so what is the problem that I'm supposed to be talking about that I've left myself 9 minutes to talk about? Is the problem that people are seeing more and more need these days to deploy on more and more platforms. And if you want to remain platform native, you have to learn all these different APIs. So that's the problem that people often try and solve. And so the real native, non-native arguments that go on today are about whether you have to do everything's for a specific platform or whether you can do stuff that is cross-platform and tries to make it work. So cross-platform is the current argument, and that's what I'm going to talk about just a little bit. Let's get one thing straight. Okay, I'm not saying this is wrong, but this is a fact and we have to live with it. Cross-platform is for the convenience of the developer and nobody else. Full stop. Cross-platform never, ever benefits the user. It may not hinder the user, it may not get in the way of the user, they may have no idea of it as a user. However, cross-platform is there for one purpose and one purpose only, to make your life easier. That's it. So we could, if we were going to say about, it has to be about the best experience ever for the user, then cross-platform, currently in its current form, 10 years' time, 5 years' time, is never going to deliver that. Can it deliver a good enough experience for the user? Can it deliver something that where the user may not even know is a different question. Okay, but it's not. So in an ideal world as a techie, you are never going to sit there and say cross-platform is best. What you might have to say is it's best for me right now with the resources I have and the things I'm looking to achieve. Okay. So, what sort of things am I talking about with cross-platform? Things like the Mono framework. Anybody use the Mono framework? Okay, some of the .NET developers are putting their hands up again. The Mono framework is basically trying to take .NET and put it to every platform, okay, so that you can basically write .NET code and then just move it around. Okay. Mono is an example of something that's trying to move virtually the whole development experience. Probably more common and been around longer are things like Qt or Qt, which are more, or GTK, which are graphics frameworks, which try and bring the fact that you only have to write your graphics code once and bring it to different platforms. The problem there are with them is you've just removed yourself from the actual platform's experience. And now, depending on which platform you're using, that has different effects. So, for example, for many years, if you were a Qt user, a Qt user, they did all the drawing by themselves. So no matter which platform you were working on, the button would look exactly the same. Okay? And then they began to do all the drawing themselves, but try and make it look more like the platform buttons. And then I think in recent releases, it now will use, if you draw a button on Mac OS X, the Qt library will use the native control from the native libraries, and on Windows it will use the native control from the native libraries. And it's beginning to look more native. I'm going to keep using that word, but it means loads of things. Beginning to look more native. The problem you have as a developer is you are always dependent on the library provider to keep up to date. You are always, and how they're choosing to implement it. And you're always in that position that if they choose not to implement something, you don't get it. You're always in the position, sometimes you're in the position that what you do on this system just doesn't make sense on this system, but you're tied to doing it that way. So even though you may be saving hours and hours of development time, you are always in a compromise. And I think that you just have to accept that. I'm not saying these libraries are wrong by any means at all. They have a place. Sometimes they are the perfect solution, but you always have to accept you are making a compromise. Okay, just to show I'm not totally bigoted, I use a number of cross-platform applications. This is app code. It's a Java application. It's where I do all my Objective-C editing. It's a brilliant editor. It does brilliant refactoring, but like most things written in Java, it's totally butt ugly, which as a Mac developer really hurts me. Really hurts. So who's a Java developer? Oh, there's more of them than .NET people. Oh dear. But Java's nice, but just butt ugly. Okay. This is an app called Postbox. It's the mail app I use because I don't like mail.app on the Mac. This is a cross-platform app, and the developers of this app have gone to a lot of effort to make it look like a Mac app, and a lot of effort to make it behave like a Mac app, and accept the same keyboard shortcuts and all those things. And most of the time I forget I'm using a cross-platform app until I get into the text editor, and it doesn't support any of the operating system native stuff. Or the other tools that I run, such as Text Expander, which allow me to type 2 or 3 characters and then expands out into something else, don't run, because it's not using a native text control from the operating system. So there are always little things. I've got 4 minutes. I'm going to have to speed up. So there is a big difference between trying to replace a platform and replace a tool in the platform. So for example, let me start talking about where I'm coming from. At RemObjects, we started with producing a product called Data Abstract. It's all about being able to keep data out somewhere in the cloud, in a server, on your own servers, and then have sort of remote access to it from your mobile application or your desktop application, briefcasing models for if you're offline, all that sort of stuff. Stuff that's really quite trendy now, even though this was started donkeys years ago. The problems are still the same. Almost every major database is written expecting that the client will be on a local network. and none of the clients, be it MySQL, Postgres, whatever, are written in a way that they handle if the data's coming across the network. They're just terrible. You have to put some other solution in place. Now, we had to start looking at producing clients for .NET, Java, iOS, and the Mac, and we actually did a Delphi client as well, because this is where RemObjects history was, back in Delphi, and had to make a choice how these were going to happen. And we made the choice at the time that actually the developers using these will want to have a native experience. They'll want the API in their environment to work the same way that they're used to APIs working in their environment. And so we had to rewrite each one individually going on there. You see, because although developers are happy to write cross-framework applications to deliver that to their users, they're probably not happy to be delivered cross-platform applications that put any limitations on them at all. Yeah, no one ever said we were fair, did it? So there we are. Okay, so during this process, RemObjects have a product called Oxygen, which is basically it's a .NET. It started off as a .NET Pascal compiler. Because it comes from a Delphi heritage, when Borland decided not to support .NET, RemObjects started a .NET Pascal compiler. It's based on Object Pascal. It eventually became Prism, that was inside the Delphi toolset. If you've ever been a Delphi user, it's no longer in there. And then a couple of years ago, I've got 2 minutes, oh dear. A couple of years ago, began to say, well, how can we take this to a different set of platforms? And we began to look at how could we compile this stuff for Android? How could we use this stuff for iOS? How could we do this stuff for iOS and for Mac? And we made the decision, based on the stuff that I've just been saying and in other arguments, that actually we need to bring efficiency and productivity where it makes sense without compromising the platform uniqueness. In other words, we wanted to be a cross-platform vendor, but we weren't going to do cross-platform. What we were going to do is try and bring productivity to make cross-platform easier for people without them having to give up the ability to access the fullness of a platform. So in other words, you could use the same language in the same IDE to develop for every platform, but you still developed to every platform's API. Okay? Now for us at the time it was Object Pascal, the IDE was Visual Studio. As of today, and today literally 9 o'clock this morning that changed, because as of today we released, you're going to be the first people in the world to hear this, there you are, don't say you weren't privileged, we have released RemObjects C#. So now we have produced a totally native cross-platform C#. So you can write, within Visual Studio still, we may add to that later on, C# code specifically for iOS or specifically for Android, the Dalvik library, specifically for things, because we've decided this is the way to go. Try and make the experience as least painful to take the best choice. So for example, this is some Android code in C#. You can see the 3 C# developers in the room will appreciate this is C#, but we're using the Android libraries, we're using intents, we're using activities. This is an Android application. We've just taken the language into C#, and you can write it in Windows if you're still in there. For example, this is a UI table view code written from an iOS application written in C#. The point being here is then on top of this, we can take an extension that we can then begin to add platform conveniences. So for example, we've added link to iOS and Android, but we're never at the expense of cutting you off from the APIs. Can I have 1 more minute? Thank you. But never at the expense, and that's the point here, because we believe, and I believe, that in order to produce really, really cool apps for a platform, you've got to get right down into the platform and use the platform at its best. And although a total cross-platform thing may be convenient, and it may be appropriate and work, at the end of the day, as developers, we like to do good technical work, and that's why we took this approach. And I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to remind you again, this is my one piece of advice when you're thinking about nativity and cross-platform and the rest of it. Look for efficiencies and productivity where it makes sense, but not at the expense of the uniqueness of the platform. If your users can't use that particular feature on iOS because you don't do iOS, or they can't use that particular Windows feature, is your app really good enough? And all of us like producing good work. That's been really fast. I've missed out half of it, but that's probably a benefit to you. So, thank you.